Hi, welcome back. This is module 2 of When the Past Feels Like It's Still Happening. So, this is going to talk more about how traumatic stress impacts your mind, your body, and your relationships. We went over some of this before, but this is going more in depth. So I like the idea or the metaphor of a stress bucket. So we all have a certain amount of stress that comes with daily life, being outside of the womb and in the world. But sometimes, if we're saddled with more stress to begin with, then it makes it harder to deal with current stress. We all experience misfortune and distress throughout our lives. And most of the time, we're able to deal with it successfully. But sometimes we are overwhelmed by a traumatic event or just an accumulation of too many things happening at once. And so the distress, the kind of stress that doesn't help us, accumulates in this bucket over time. So maybe we interpret the world in a way that makes us distressed regularly. Like we think that everyone is out to get us or we can't trust anyone. And then we're disconnected from other people. And this, as you probably know, is not a healthy mind state to have as your default setting. As you'll see, growing up in chaotic and dysfunctional environments with lots of challenges fills our stress buckets up early on. And there's not much room for much else. We're always kind of playing catch up. Whereas someone who is born with secure attachment to their caregivers and they feel safe in the world, they don't have as much in their stress bucket. So when something new and challenging or overwhelming happens to them, it's kind of easier in some sense. Um, I suppose there's a certain amount of stress that primes you for being able to know what to do, but usually this stress doesn't help us that much. Um, so when we grow up, we already have part of our stress bucket full, and that can compromise our ability to handle stress effectively. And so that can contribute to ill ease and a lack of physical and mental health. So I don't know if you remember, but we talked about some of the warning signs of trauma exposure, including feeling helpless and hopeless, um, feeling hypervigilant, and that's just a fancy way of feeling like you always have to be on the lookout for something bad that's going to happen, feeling inadequate or feeling impotent, not feeling like you can make room for the gray area. The world is either black or white. Someone's either good or bad. You either can't trust anyone or you have to trust everyone. And it makes for a lack of creativity and flexibility in the way we deal with things. We kind of have a cookie cutter approach to everything, and minimizing what happened to you too. Some people dwell on it a lot, and other people go, "Oh, that wasn't that bad," but they don't really realize that maybe it was that bad. And feeling fatigued and getting sick easily. It can compromise your immune system to be distressed a lot. So even if you may not recognize a concrete trauma that led to feeling this way, it's possible that it happened and you kind of put it out of your mind because it's too painful or upsetting to look at. So here's some more warning signs: feeling irritable, impatient, feeling guilty or inappropriately fearful and feeling kind of cynical, like thinking the worst of people and situations. Empathy fatigue, that's when um, you just don't care anymore whether someone else is suffering. Your suffering is taking up all the space in your stress bucket. And after everything that you went through, you feel like, your problems are nothing. And also, you may have known people who have gone through a traumatic event and turned to smoking cigarettes a lot or drinking a lot of alcohol, taking street drugs or prescription drugs, and some behaviors like working all the time, eating too much, getting in kind of reckless sexual situations. These are all possible signs of stress and trauma. So you may wonder, why do I get overwhelmed by these traumatic events? So when things happen unexpectedly or suddenly, it kind of messes with your sense of the world as being predictable and safe and full of justice, which is um, a long-handed way of saying an assumptive world. So we can't assume that you can go out and not be victimized by someone or not have something bad happen to you. So the world no longer looks the same after certain events. And maybe you remember 9/11, which was a pretty traumatic event for the United States of America. Um, you may also have a more personal uh, traumatic event, like your lover hurts you, slaps you across the face, or maybe someone cheats on you, or maybe the first time your parent hits you or touches you inappropriately. So after that, the world just doesn't feel safe anymore. You thought that you could count on certain things, and poof, that's gone. So when something like this happens, it's easy to feel powerless and helpless and just shocked or stunned. And if the hits keep coming, you have to learn how to adapt somehow. So your whole focus becomes about predicting the unpredictable or the next bad thing and managing the unmanageable, all the feelings and thoughts that come after that. And this is hard to kind of make sense of or sustain. And all of this affects your mood and your relationship to yourself and others, your physical well being, and sometimes spiritually, like we were talking about in the last module. So maybe you've found yourself being really angry and irritable lately. And maybe it's not something that just comes and goes, it's sort of like a chronic feeling. You might feel irritated and on edge because your nervous system is being geared towards fighting and fleeing. And even minor things seem really important for some reason after the trauma. You might fly off the handle or do things that you later regret or you're embarrassed about. You might think that people that you used to trust will hurt you or betray you, which makes it hard to get along with people and keep a cool head when conflict comes up. So, um, some things to consider when you're feeling annoyed or angry are, when do you need to step back and take a minute to reflect before acting on this anger? Is this situation really threatening, or does it just remind you of something that happened in the past? When is it a good idea to stand up for yourself? Or when should you kind of take a step back and wait to see what happens? And are you looking for a fight right now? Would it feel really good to just let someone have it and get really ticked off and unload on someone? And if you can, it might be good to also ask yourself, what am I really angry about? What's upsetting me? And is it worth the possible consequences to act out on my anger? So we talked about fight. Now let's talk about flight and fear. Fear can be useful in the short run, but anxiety in the long run hurts us. It's natural to feel fearful or anxious in a dangerous situation. If you're in an immediate danger, like we talked about, it's life saving to get out of there as soon as possible. But if you start to associate something that's unrelated to danger with feeling threatened, then that can become a problem. For example, let's say you were trapped in an elevator and you feared for your life. Later, you can't ride in elevators because you associate that with feeling fearful and feeling like you were going to run out of oxygen. Um, Another example that I like to use with EMDR clients is, let's say you were attacked by a dog, but it was a really big, mean dog, and you were very small when that happened. So now, even if you see a Chihuahua or a little tiny teacup terrier, you still react with the same amount of fear, even if it's a friendly dog. So the brain makes these associations so quickly, so that you can remember things that threaten you, but it does it in a very kind of coarse, general way. And in that moment, when you feel threatened, the more logical part of your brain is not engaged. So you just kind of make this broad assumption or this broad generalization that dog equals threat or elevator equals threat. And it makes it so that you don't kind of consider, well, this is a different situation. This is a friendly dog. He's licking my hand. Or this elevator seems to be running just fine. There's nothing to worry about. So then you start avoiding neutral things that you associate with a traumatic event because you think they're dangerous. Or maybe your nervous system, you, rationally, like this is a safe dog or an elevator that appears to be running, but your nervous system feels like, no, this isn't safe. Unfortunately, the more you avoid it, the worse your fear gets because you never really get to challenge it or to desensitize yourself to the anxiety that is paired with that neutral stimulus. And so it just feeds your anxiety and perpetuates itself. That means that you miss out on opportunities for just functioning normal, or that you don't get to have fun because you're not willing to try new situations. Maybe you've developed anxiety over time because you've been in a situation where you felt threatened repeatedly and you never got to escape. And like we said, fear's there to protect us from things that endanger us. And when you have to protect yourself all the time, it becomes anxiety. It becomes really generalized. And it's natural to flee from or avoid things that seem dangerous, but we can lose sight of what's actually dangerous versus what's just uncomfortable or unfamiliar. Just like with anger, you can check out the environment to see if anything in this moment truly endangers your present survival, which may be hard if you've been in dangerous situations for a long time, like an abusive relationship or in an abusive household growing up or in combat for a long time. You might think of all the things that could be dangerous, even if they're not happening to you right now. So this gets hardwired into your brain as your default state sometimes. And you approach everything as a potential threat. You might flinch or feel tight in your body or cower in the face of something that reminds you of a threat. You might also give up when someone bullies you or tries to manipulate you. And you might develop panic attacks or generalized anxiety, social anxiety, separation anxiety after exposure to long lasting threats. And so all of this kind of combines in your nervous system and prevents you from feeling at ease and safe. And of course, your mood can also be affected by being in traumatic situations. So it's important to kind of distinguish grief from sadness, although trauma and grief go hand in hand in a lot of situations. For example, if you were in an abusive situation, you may feel grief for the childhood or the marriage that you wish you would have had, or the relationship you wish you would have had. But sadness and depression are different from each other, and they're also different from grief, although people who have grief can be sad for sure. So you might think you're depressed when you're actually just mourning the experience that you wish you had. Or you might feel depressed. Um, you might think you're depressed because you just feel sad. So usually moods don't last that long. They might last a day or two, but emotions come and go, as you have probably seen in yourself and other people. When they hang around for a long time, and the negative emotions, and they impact you in a way that makes it harder to function and harder to get along with people, then they start to become mood disorders. So sadness is part of depression. You know, a lot of people feel sad when they're depressed, but a person could just naturally be sad because their dog died or because they lost a promotion or they lost their job. And it doesn't necessarily mean that just because you feel sad that you have depression or that you are, yeah, experiencing mood disorder. Depression also has other features like emptiness, what they call anhedonia or disinterest and lack of pleasure and things that used to give you pleasure. And a depressed person often feels helpless or hopeless and low energy, and sometimes thinks about suicide. Also, poor appetite and an inability to sleep or sleeping too much, problems with appetite and weight loss or gain. And so, even in some cases, insomnia. Grief and depression can look similar, but grief is specific to loss. So when you resolve the grief, usually in about 6 to 12 months, your sadness usually goes away. Someone might mention the thing or person that you lost, and you might choke up a little or feel sad, but generally you feel okay by the time you've resolved your grief. Whereas depression, it it kind of lingers and it stays with you and it's more global. So unless your grief is complicated, you usually gradually feel better after 6 to 12 months. Whereas complicated grief is specific to loss, and people usually don't feel helpless or hopeless with that. So all in all, sadness usually comes and goes, and it's usually specific to something bad that happened, but it's not global. And depression, on the other hand, influences how you look at yourself and life in general. And sometimes people also develop dissociation, and dissociation can take different forms. Um, Dissociation is a useful coping strategy, especially if you're trapped in a situation where you're being hurt or you're being threatened and there's no escape. So it's a way that you can feel disconnected from memories, thoughts, or what's happening right now, your emotions, or even your identity. So, for example, if someone is being abused and they have no escape, they might say, okay, that's happening to that person over there. And they find a way, not consciously, but unconsciously, to remove themselves from the situation. Sometimes it's helpful and you're able to do it consciously. So, for example, if I stub my toe and I have a business meeting and I have to pretend like the toe isn't hurting me like crazy, I can put my attention somewhere else. And while the pain is going on, I can kind of dissociate my attention from it. But sometimes it's not helpful and it seems to have a mind of its own. So it's a psychological phenomenon that happens on a continuum. So at a mild end of the continuum, if you've ever driven somewhere and found yourself at your destination without knowing how you got there, that is a mild form of dissociation. Or if you've been so wrapped up in a movie that you forgot to check the oven and you wound up burning something in the oven. So hypnosis uses dissociation in a healthy way to help you get around your critical mind and your everyday conscious thinking and to access your unconscious mind. But when it becomes involuntary, when it's something that you are forced to do in order to survive, it can turn into a dissociative psychological disorder. So sometimes when people have panic disorder, they might feel derealization, like what's going on around them is not real, or depersonalization. They might not feel like they're really them. Um, there's also some dissociation that happens with borderline personality disorder or with complex PTSD. In more extreme situations, people develop whole other alters or altered personalities. So that used to be called multiple personality disorder, but now it's called dissociative identity disorder. People can also have dissociative amnesia, where they can't remember big chunks of their childhood or something traumatic that happened to them. They just cannot access it consciously. Fugue states where they do things that they don't remember doing, like they might get on a train and go somewhere and they're not aware that they're doing it. And derealization or depersonalization disorder. So that's where they have derealization and depersonalization on a regular basis, and it causes problems in their lives. So let's unpack some of these dissociative disorders. As I mentioned, dissociative identity disorder involves the presence of two or more distinct personality states that control your behavior, consciousness, and your memory. And the parts are referred to as alters. Some people call them ego states as well. And they could have their own names and characteristics and memories. So, for example, one part of a person with DID might hold all the traumatic memories, and some other part might hold all the good memories, and some other part might be a perfectionist and have to be perfect all the time to avoid being hurt. And there may be memory gaps for things that happen while the person is in the control of the other identity. As we mentioned, derealization, depersonalization disorder is sort of like a more chronic state of these phenomena. So depersonalization is feeling disconnected from your own body, mind, thoughts, emotions, like you're observing yourself from the outside. A sense of unreality or detachment from the external world is derealization. So you may feel like you're in a dream or the world is made up or a fantasy world. There's also dissociative amnesia. So you might not be able to recall important personal information, often related to traumatic events. And it can't be explained by substance use or ordinary forgetfulness. And the memory loss is usually selective. It's just related to the trauma. You may still have a general memory of other aspects of your life. There's also a sort of catch-all dissociative disorder called other specified dissociative disorder. And so this is sort of like a little wastebasket for symptoms that are dissociative, but they don't fit the previously mentioned disorders. And you may still have significant dissociative problems, including identity disturbance, memory problems, and detachment, but you don't quite fit into these other categories. And as I mentioned, a fugue state is temporary and sudden amnesia for your own identity, and also a purposeful travel or wandering away from your usual environment. So you're likely to assume a new identity, and you may not remember any identity at all. So you might be wondering, how common is this? Because you hear about this in movies and books, and how do you treat it? So it's hard to estimate and diagnose dissociative disorders, but an estimated 1% of the population in the USA has DID. So it's about 1 in every 100 people. And the percentage is higher, tenfold, in inpatient and outpatient psychiatric settings. So more rare are the derealization, depersonalization disorder, and dissociative amnesia and fugue. So you can receive psychotherapy and medication for the treatment of dissociative disorders. And some of these therapies include DID therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT, dialectical behavioral therapy, or DBT. There's a lot of acronyms here. EMDR therapy, which I'll talk about later in greater depth. Internal family systems, that's sort of a hot new therapy these days, and psychodynamic therapy. And the goal is to understand the cause of the condition, develop new ways to cope with stress, and release the pain and the shock and distress from the past events. So the identity can be made whole, or the fragments of memory can be pulled together again. And this is memory reconsolidation, which happens when with meditation too. And that's part of trauma therapy. Some of the medications that psychiatric places will prescribe include antidepressants, anxiety medication, antipsychotic medications, but there's no specific medication that's approved by the FDA for the treatment of dissociative disorders. The first line treatment is really therapy, and medications are mostly for acute symptom management, meaning, like, let's say you're having trouble sleeping or you're having a mood disturbance alongside your dissociative identity disorder, then that's where medication could help. And medications don't resolve the stress or the trauma that caused the dissociative disorder. You might have also heard of this thing called complex PTSD. So there are different types of traumatic events, as you probably have already gathered. Acute trauma happens when there's a single traumatic event that occurs to you. So let's say you got struck by a car or bitten by a dog. If you have enough current internal and external resources, like you're in a safe environment at home, or you have enough emotional support, you can escape the perpetrator, or you have someone who protects you from the trauma, then the trauma can be resolved much more easily than chronic traumatic events. If you're trapped in a situation and you can't get away, and the trauma happens frequently, the trauma becomes more complicated or complex. Complex PTSD is like regular PTSD. But it involves ongoing unwanted reminders of the trauma. And it also you avoid triggers and reminders of the trauma. Your thoughts and feelings are shaped by the traumatic experience. And there's more physical and emotional reactivity. But the more prolonged distress you endure, the worse the impact. So childhood abuse and people who are in domestic violence situations often have repeated traumatic events, and they don't, in the case of children, they really can't escape. And as a kid, you don't have the resources to cope with the traumas. So you do your best to cope as best as a kid can, really. Complicated or complex PTSD has symptoms related to disturbance in your self-concept. So you might feel worthless or shame. You're ashamed of what happened to you, even though you had no control over it. But somehow you internalize that shame that was done to you, or you're just embarrassed that you were treated that way. You might also have difficulty managing and controlling your emotions. So you might have mood swings and intense anger outbursts. Sometimes you also have more trouble dealing with other people. So you may not be able to form healthy relationships, or you may distrust everyone, or you may trust too easily. So, of course, attachment is related to this, especially in the case of um, domestic violence and childhood abuse. Uh, Disruptions in attachment can usually lead to insecure attachment, and you may have complicated relationships with other people. So it may be hard to establish and maintain healthy boundaries. Like, you can't do that to me, or I don't want to do that. You may have chronic feelings of emptiness. You may have a hard time getting close to people, and you may feel betrayed by caregivers or trusted others. And in terms of treatment, you may have to have more comprehensive long-term therapy that addresses not only your trauma symptoms, but also the broader attachment issues, the interpersonal and emotional difficulties. And so learning DBT skills may be useful, which I'll talk about in Module 3. And also, sometimes psychodynamic work can help with this. So you may wonder what happens to you when your caregiver is unavailable or dangerous. Now, I don't know if you remember in the first video, but we talked about ACE studies, and ACE stands for Adverse Childhood Experiences. So back in 1998, researchers at Kaiser Foundation found that ACEs, like physical or sexual abuse, affect people's mental and physical well-being. And the higher the number of ACEs that you experience meant that you were more likely to have health problems. So if you have an ACE score of 4 or more, you're twice as likely to smoke cigarettes, 2.5 times more likely to get sexually transmitted disease through multiple unprotected sex, and 7 times as likely to inject street drugs, 12 times as likely to attempt suicide than people who weren't traumatized. And you're also more likely to develop mood disorders, emotional problems, and anxiety. So some of the health problems related to high ACEs, this is a link right here that you can use to find out what your ACE score is. Anyway, you may be more likely to develop obesity and being highly overweight. You might develop COPD, or chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. You may have ischemic heart disease, liver disease. You may be at increased risk for being in an abusive or violent intimate relationship. You may develop lung cancer, autoimmune diseases, migraines, cigarette smoking, suicide attempts, unintended pregnancies. You may start having sex at an early age, and you may become pregnant at an early age. You may start smoking at an early age. So you may wonder how your ACEs may have affected you. Another tragedy in adolescence or childhood is losing a parent to deportation or suicide or overdose. They may go to jail or prison or go to a mental institution or they may just flat out abandon you. Many children are left to fend for themselves if only one parent is trying to be the breadwinner as well as the caretaker. So again, this is a place where you can find out what your individual ACE score is. I've worked with people who've had all 10 of the ACEs listed on that quiz. So the purpose of talking about this is not to blame your caregivers or feel like you're a victim. You can have the freedom to create a new life for yourself. And you also have the responsibility to make you and your family lives the best you can. But it's important to recognize when you face more stress and challenges than the average person. Mostly to give yourself a break and not be so hard on yourself. If you know where you have coping skills deficits from your childhood, you can build those skills and develop self-compassion, and that makes life a lot easier. Now, having said all that, there is a phenomenon called post-traumatic growth. It is possible to, even when you're very upset by a traumatic event, you can also grow and change in a positive way from it. And this is called post-traumatic growth. Sometimes people report that they are positively transformed after a traumatic event, which can include developing more compassion for other people or animals, more maturity and strength. It can improve people's decision making, and it may help you find meaning in the traumatic event. Sometimes it also toughens people up, not in the sense that, oh, you need to toughen up and get a thicker skin, but sometimes when something really awful happens, it puts other things in perspective, like, oh, I got through losing my infant through a stillbirth, or I got through combat, or I got through an abusive childhood. So this thing that's happening to me right now is not much compared to that. So I know that I got through that, so I can get through this as well. So it gives people a little bit of confidence in that way. So there's something about going through a moderate amount of struggle that seems to awaken positive qualities in some people. And it's not the default reaction to trauma, but it's more common than you might think. So there are 5 areas of post-traumatic growth that researchers have measured: more appreciation of new life and new priorities, deeper connections with others, greater personal strength, or I guess you could call it grit, recognizing new possibilities in your life, and spiritual development. That's the finding new meaning. So what works in your favor if you've been traumatized? These 2 researchers, Tedeschi and Calhoun, have done a lot of work around post-traumatic growth, and they say the widespread assumptions is that trauma often results in disorders, and that should not be replaced with expectations like growth as an inevitable result. But we are finding that continuing personal distress and growth often coexist. So the 2 can coexist. That's good news. So post-traumatic growth and hardship are not mutually exclusive. Now, post-traumatic growth is different from resiliency, which is the ability to bounce back after going through extreme hardship. You can go on with your life and have a purposeful life even after going through an extreme stress. And there's also stress hardiness, which is a sense of control over the events in your life. You feel like you can overcome negative experiences. And you're also very committed to whatever purpose you feel you serve on earth. So you have a sense like, I'm here to do something important. I matter. My life matters. I'm here on a mission, so to speak. You view life as challenges to overcome, and you welcome the opportunity to develop as a result of adversity. And optimism doesn't hurt either. That's just the belief that positive outcomes are possible in addition to negative ones. So there's also a sense of coherence, which means that you're in a good position to manage stress because you understand events and you can cope with them and find meaning in them. So all these ideas are related to, but not exactly the same as post-traumatic growth. So you may wonder, where can I get some of this PTG or post-traumatic growth? In addition to dealing with traumatic stress, you can also discover how your trauma developed your abilities, your stress coping, and your ability to learn more about your inner resources. So your traumatic events might have benefited you by making you stronger or more compassionate, by increasing your gratitude for your survival. So you're lucky to be alive and you realize it and you tell yourself, I'm lucky to be here. I'm lucky for what I have now and for what's good in your life. It may have strengthened your commitment to living a good life, which is, none of this is meant to invalidate your suffering or what you went through or the importance of the traumas in your life. It is, however, kind of a ray of hope, I would think, that something good can come out of your suffering. I wonder if you can name at least one thing that you've discovered about yourself and your ability to survive a traumatic event. And how has it made you more self-aware and more aware of what other living creatures experience? So that's it for this slide, for this module. So we've discussed many trauma symptoms and ways of coping with short-term stress that can get hardened into our coping strategies and eventually create problems for us. We've also looked at how adverse childhood experiences from childhood and adolescence can create extra stress that we lug around like a bunch of water in our stress buckets, and they affect us physically and mentally. We need to recognize that when our stress buckets are full, we need to clear out some of the old yucky water from the past so it doesn't keep overfilling. Not all the news is bad, though. There's also resilience, the ability to bounce back from stress. There's post-traumatic growth. How is it that you can find the good part of what happened to you? How can you recognize the ways that you've been strengthened and tempered by the traumatic event? What makes you resilient? These are worth considering. When you get mental health treatment, the focus is often on eliminating symptoms, the things that get in the way of enjoying your life. So you do feel stronger sometimes as well. And isn't that worth considering? So before or after the guided meditation that follows, you might want to do the next two exercises in the workbook. But if you decide that you want to hang on for the guided meditation, just stay with me here. So once again, you have the opportunity to do a guided meditation with me to integrate the learning that you've had today from this material. Make sure you're not driving, babysitting, or doing anything that you need to pay attention to consciously. Get into a comfortable space where you won't be disturbed. And have some water handy, something to write with, maybe a cushion or blanket for your comfort. This time we're focusing on creating a safer space within you. I say safer and not safe because sometimes trauma survivors have a hard time considering ever feeling completely safe again. So let's compromise and find a place that's comfortable and safe enough, maybe familiar or something you create in your imagination. Let's begin. By now, you've been practicing getting comfortable and still within by listening to the first guided meditation exercise before. So you already know that focusing within is an essential first step in the process of learning to handle your stress in a different way. And you've learned to let my voice coax you in a direction intended to help you unlearn the patterns you developed in the past on how to cope with trauma. And you've noticed and learned that you can think of one thing with your conscious mind and have quite another experience with your unconscious mind. And the conscious mind can be unconscious of what the unconscious mind is doing, or the unconscious mind may pay no heed to what the conscious mind is conscious of. And isn't it nice to know that both minds can be helping you in very different ways? And so as you find yourself in this quiet, comfortable spot again, where you won't be disturbed for a while, where you and I can have this time to allow for different patterns of coping to emerge. You've learned how you have been affected by your past, and now you can learn how to have a better future as well. A future is a tempting place to be, but the past can also be informative and helpful. There was a time when you didn't know how to roll from your stomach to your back, or when you couldn't feed yourself. You may not have been able to brush your teeth or comb your hair back then, but with time you gradually picked up skills and learned through direct instruction or by observing older people in your life. And you wanted to be like them. So you copied their behavior. With time, you were able to decide what made sense for you to do independently. But at first, you were so dependent on others to look out for you. So now, I'm inviting you to call to mind a person, or maybe even a non-human being who looked out for you, who had your back, so to speak. Maybe it was a family member, like an older sibling or a cousin, an aunt or uncle, a grandparent, or a friend, a classmate, maybe a teacher or coach, or a priest or rabbi, some spiritual leader. You can just glide back in time and check your vast inner library of memories, images, people you've known, finding that right person who made you feel safe, safe like you belong, or safer, someone who was really there for you. Maybe it was a pet or a figure from your spiritual beliefs. Some people feel comforted by Jesus or Buddha, Allah, Krishna, whatever really feels comfortable for you. Just allow yourself to explore with your unconscious mind or with your conscious mind. But don't try too hard consciously to allow your unconscious mind to find the right fit. It will just feel right when you land on that special someone. And as your unconscious mind searches for that special someone, you can be considering or wondering consciously how this will help you cope better with your past. And the answer to that is found in attachment. When you're small and helpless, you need to attach to someone who will take care of your needs. As you grow older, the needs change and you become more independent. But you always need someone in your life who's looking out for you. So you won't feel lonely or disconnected out there on your own. Have you ever noticed how talking to a friend or just having someone sit with you when you're down can make all the difference in the world when you're having a tough time? We're wired for love and connection to others, whether we like it or not. We were never meant to travel and live by ourselves. It's not to say that we can't have enjoyment in alone time, but we need people and they need us. And whether you're 2 or 102, we need at least one other person, hopefully more, to survive emotionally and psychologically and even physically in this complex, baffling world. Hopefully by now you've arrived at a person. If not, that's okay. You can make someone up if you need to. Thinking of all the qualities you'd like in a friend or caregiver, pulling those qualities together to make up the person or the being that you want by your side when the stuff hits the fan. You want them to be strong, powerful, soft, gentle, nurturing. How does this being interact with you? Do they speak to you in a certain way to uplift you or console you? Do they encourage you to get back on the proverbial horse? Or do they let you just be sitting by your side with patient, loving eyes? You can really create a strong presence of love and support in your life. Support that carries you through tough times. You can also share your dreams and aspirations, your triumphs and accomplishments with this person or being. You can confide your worst nightmares or experiences, or go to them with your fears or embarrassing stories. This being never judges you, never criticizes you. They're just there, consistently supporting and keeping you on the right path, the path to your best life, the best life you could possibly have. Maybe you're an auditory person and you'd like to hear them talking to you. What does their voice sound like? What does it feel like to be in their presence? Are they affectionate and physically close? Or do you observe them more from a distance? Whatever feels most comfortable to you is how you can let this being support you. I don't know if you have a clear mental picture of them or if their sound is more present for you. Maybe you just have a felt sense in your body. But once you have a very clear sense of their presence, you can allow them to settle into your body. Maybe your head or your heart, or whatever part of your body you want to sense them in. And notice what it's like to sense them, to feel their loving presence. Do you notice warmth, tingling, coolness? It can be anything you notice now. Really getting a sense of how it is to embody this support, comfort, and containment. When you have that sense in your body, know that you can always come back to it whenever you want or need it. It's always there unconsciously. The thing is, every time You tap into the experience by listening to the recording. You get a stronger sense of being loved and supported. And what before you only sensed unconsciously can also start to become conscious. And eventually, without even listening to this, you can call that special someone up when you want them and need them. And they're right there, just like that. You don't have to call or text or email them. They're right there inside of you. Isn't it nice to know that you always have that built-in support? And this process of connecting with that being can keep developing long after you get up from your seat. This sense of that safer person or being gets stronger and clearer every time you engage with them. The more you listen and engage, the better you become at reaching that part. Knowing this can help you feel more confident in handling whatever strong feelings arise in your day-to-day life. And for now, you can know that that process will continue. But you can start to come back into the room and become more consciously aware of your surroundings, what you're sitting on, what you're touching. Feeling energy come back into your muscles and body, more alert, energetic, refreshed, and ready to resume your everyday activities. And on the count of 3, open your eyes. 1, might move around a little to get the blood circulating again. 2, feeling more consciously aware. 3, open your eyes, refreshed and alert and wide awake all over.